In the early summer of 1931, while the cast and crew of Frankenstein baked under studio lights, a tall, gaunt Englishman lay strapped to a slab. Fantastical lighting machines crackled inches from his chest as a special effects crew dangled white-hot carbon rods above him, and beads of sweat rolled down his made-up forehead. For 30 hours he would endure the same torture. Layers of quilted padding soaked in sweat, 11-pound boots, a brace forcing his shoulders to slump, all to bring an unnamed creature to life. When Universal finally released the film that December, his name wasn't even on the marquee. He was billed simply as a literal question mark. Yet that faceless role would transform William Henry Pratt into Boris Karloff and usher him into the pantheon of horror legends. Welcome to Hollywood Mysteries. Boris Karloff was born as William Henry Pratt on 23rd of November 1887 at Herne Villas on Forest Hill Road in East Dulwich, the youngest of 9 children. His father, Edward John Pratt, an Anglo-Indian official in the Indian Salt Revenue Service, was notorious for drunken violence. Family lore recorded that he once threw his wife, Eliza Miller, down a flight of stairs and dragged one of his daughters around the house by her hair. These were seemingly not isolated incidents. Eliza left him in 1889, and some sources even claim she divorced him, which would have been a shocking act for the era, and moved her brood between London suburbs before settling in Enfield by 1902. William never really knew his father, who disappeared from his life when the boy was just 2. Edward Pratt died in Paris in 1897. The youngest son inherited a composite heritage. Both his parents were born in colonial Bombay, and both had at least some Indian ancestry. His father likely had an Indian grandparent, and his mother was unquestionably of mixed heritage, being descended from Anglo-Indian and Siamese lines, some of which were famous, particularly his great-aunt Anna Leon Owens, whose life inspired The King and I. Anna had concealed her own Asian heritage and passed herself off as a Welsh widow, and this attempt to hide the bloodline would pass on to the entire Pratt family. That mixed ancestry gave the boy a darker complexion that he could not hide in a society obsessed with race, and as he grew up he found himself jeered at for both his dark looks and for his speech impediments. He was bow-legged, he stuttered badly, and he spoke with a lisp. Both teachers and peers mocked his bent legs, and doctors suggested they be broken and reset. These cruelties instilled in him both a stubborn resilience and a tenderness toward outsiders that later suffused his monsters with pathos. Many years later, his daughter, Sarah, recounted a simple anecdote that revealed so much about her father's personality. "We had some close family friends who raised rabbits, and I wanted one so much," she recalled. Asked by her father to pick one out, she decided on a perfectly formed bunny, leaving behind another which had a bent ear. On the drive home, her father asked why she hadn't chosen the floppy-eared rabbit, saying he would have picked that one. Quote, "Because that's the one that needed the most love." As the new century unfolded and William progressed through his schooling, expectations were soon placed upon him. His elder brothers, 5 of them, expected him to join the consular service and arranged for him to attend Uppingham School and later King's College in London. However, at 9, he experienced a moment of revelation. Cast as the Demon King in a Christmas pantomime of Cinderella, he relished the excited hiss of the audience as he unfurled his cloak and decided to become an actor. In 1906, the Largs family was hit by another tragedy when Eliza died. The family were middle class and there was an inheritance, although being only 18, William would not be entitled to his portion for another 3 years, when he reached legal adulthood at 21. By 1908, he found himself dutifully studying for the diplomatic exam, but he had hatched a plan. He deliberately failed. instead desperate to pursue acting and hoping the failure would convince his family to let him follow his dream. But the decision was a scandal in a family of civil servants who had an empire to administer. His brothers forbade him from performing even in a church pantomime and withheld money so that he could not even rent rehearsal space. When his family's solicitor suggested that the black sheep be shipped overseas to Canada or Australia, the brothers took him at his word. So William flipped a coin. The unfortunate losers were the Canadians, he later joked. In 1909, he took his inheritance money and sailed steerage to Canada, hoping that on a different continent his family would have less control over him. With little idea of what else to do, he found himself in a pasture at dawn, a halter in hand, expected to round up horses, something he'd never done before. Manual labor was his lot for the next decade, digging drainage ditches for the BC Electric Company for $2.80 per 10-hour day, clearing land, chopping trees, and lugging cement sacks, work that permanently damaged his back. Between jobs, he devoured theater reviews and looked for chances to perform. In Vancouver, he joined the Gene Russell Players, and then the Harry St. Clair Repertory Company. He started by painting scenery and hauling trunks. Eventually, he earned small roles and then leading parts for £6 a week. On tour in Kamloops, the company asked him to choose a stage name for the program. He improvised a Slavic first name that sounded exotic, Boris. The new name, he later joked, was pulled from thin Canadian air. He adopted the surname Karloff, falsely claiming that it was his mother's maiden name. It also offered him camouflage. In the United States at the time, South Asian immigrants were subject to exclusionary laws, and a violent racism that was on another level entirely from the already intense prejudices found in Britain and Canada. If his dream was to make it in the U.S. one day, then a Russian-sounding surname would act as a cloak for his Anglo-Indian roots, just exotic enough to be a plausible explanation for his looks, and yet still European. He began putting together a story, telling interviewers that his mother was Russian and his father English. Even his legal documents reflected the change. When he married his first wife, Grace Harding, in 1910, he signed the marriage certificate as Boris Karloff. A transformation was taking place. That marriage dissolved within 3 years, a pattern that repeated as he wedded and divorced Olive de Wilton, Montana Lorena Williams, and Helene Vivian Soule through the 1910s and 1920s. The constant touring and precarious finances of a repertory actor left little space for domestic stability, it seems. Curiously, however, he would never make mention of any of these 4 wives again for the rest of his life. He would not even tell his later family he had been married before. The life of a provincial actor in Canada during the 1910s was brutal and precarious. Troupes played weekly repertory. Actors memorized new plays while performing current ones, built scenery, sewed costumes, and even passed the hat to cover travel expenses. When a tornado wiped out the theater in Regina, the company was forced to disband and Karloff took a job at a haulage firm. If a force of nature had upended his theater gig, then sheer random chance was about to set him on a new path. Someone flung a theatrical journal out of a train window as it passed through a station, and Karloff picked it up. In it, his eyes fell on an advertisement for an actor with the Prince Albert Players in Saskatchewan. Karloff applied and was hired, and he was soon touring the Canadian prairies in this much more prestigious outfit. He found his stride performing melodramas and farces to audiences of farmers and railroad workers, and gradually mastered his stutter through careful breathing, though his lisp remained. He attempted to bring the repertory company to Chicago in 1914, but there was little interest. He also tried to enlist in the British Army when the First World War broke out, but a doctor found a heart murmur and rejected him. My money was disappearing rapidly, he later remembered. I decided to go back where I was appreciated, meaning the stage. He hit the road again in Canada and also now through the American Midwest. These years were formative. He learned to build sets, manage finances, and manage his voice. When he finally moved to Los Angeles in 1919, he had already appeared in dozens of plays and had developed the discipline that would later sustain him in the makeup chair. Hollywood in the 1920s was a boomtown for film extras, but Karloff's dark features limited him to stereotypical roles. He played Native Americans in westerns and villains of indeterminate ethnicity in silent serials. The pay was pitiful, often $5 a day, and he supplemented his income by working as a truck driver and cement hauler. While trudging home in a downpour after a grueling day on extra duty, he caught another small break. An expensive automobile pulled up and offered him a ride. Inside was Lon Chaney Sr., the master of the grotesque. Chaney gave him a piece of advice: cultivate something unique. Karloff listened and began experimenting with makeup, finding ways to accentuate rather than tone down his unique appearance. With the arrival of sound, he feared his lisp and baritone voice would end his career, only to discover that the new technology actually favored distinctive voices. Directors began to hire him for bit parts in gangster films and melodramas. The gravitas in his delivery was a real asset. His first real break arrived in 1930. The Belasco Theater in Los Angeles staged The Criminal Code, a play about a wrongfully convicted man. Karloff played a hardened convict with a menacing presence, and his performance drew the attention of elite director Howard Hawks. Hawks later cast him in the film adaptation of the play, and this gave him his first serious screen role. It was enough to get him noticed by another big-shot director, one who would alter his life completely. James Whale was preparing to adapt Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, and his first choice for the monster, Bela Lugosi, turned down the role because he did not want to bury his famous face under layers of makeup. In the cafe of Universal's commissary, Whale spotted Karloff's weathered face, heavy-lidded eyes, and gaunt cheeks, and invited him to a screen test. A monster, Karloff later recalled. I needed to eat, and I took it. Makeup artist Jack Pierce shaved his head, applied cotton and collodion to broaden his brow, and inserted bolts in his neck. Karloff removed a dental bridge to hollow his cheeks. The costume included boots weighted with lead and asphalt that added 20 pounds to his already aching back. The work was punishing. He stood on set for hours under hot lights, his body encased in foam, while electrical arcs flashed overhead. When Frankenstein opened in November 1931, audiences gasped at the creature's jerky resurrection, then found themselves moved by its confused, childlike expressions. In one scene, the monster reaches toward a light, wanting to warm himself. In another, he plays with a little girl, throwing flowers into a lake before we see the other side of the monster. He inadvertently drowns her, his naivety visible for all to see in the most horrifying way. Karloff played these scenes with heartbreaking innocence, showing not a mindless brute but a lonely outcast who reacts violently only when provoked. Reviewers who had expected cheap thrills instead praised the nuance. The New York Times called the performance, quote, a poignant conception of pathos. The unknown actor behind the question mark was suddenly famous. Overnight fame brought wealth, but also the risk of typecasting. Universal rushed Karloff into a cycle of now classic horror pictures over the following 3 years. The Old Dark House, The Mummy, The Mask of Fu Manchu, The Black Cat, and The Excellent Bride of Frankenstein. In The Mummy, he played the ancient priest Imhotep, his eyes smoldering with centuries of longing for his lost bride. Despite his undead state, he delivered a performance of restrained passion, one which showed that the villain's cruelty stemmed from real grief. He reprised the monster in both The Bride of Frankenstein and Son of Frankenstein, and each time he managed to deepen the character's humanity. Both were very worthy sequels, and many consider the second film in particular to be the highlight of the series, in part due to Elsa Lanchester's incredible turn as Mary Shelley and the monster's visually striking bride. Between these films, he worked constantly, alternating classic horror pictures like The Mummy with gangster roles in the original Scarface, which both released in 1932, and war dramas like The Lost Patrol from a couple of years later. At Universal, he often worked with Bela Lugosi. Some fans believe the two were bitter rivals, a theme which was amplified by gossip columnists for years. Nonetheless, evidence suggests that not only was there no such rivalry, they even dined together and occasionally played cards. That said, the frequently repeated claim that Lugosi was Sarah's godfather is not true, even if that would have made a good counterpoint to the rivalry rumors. When Lugosi died in 1956, Karloff paid for part of his funeral expenses. Both men had been typecast by single roles. Both understood the burden and the benefits of that fate. Even if Lugosi initially felt put out by Karloff's rise, Boris was simply not a man anyone could take a dislike to. Karloff's kindness on set, he memorized lines to cue other actors, arrived early to help novices rehearse, and never upstaged his colleagues, made him widely respected. Beyond the sound stages, Karloff found solace in quiet hobbies. He loved reading and gardening, and he became an avid cricketer. In 1932, he joined fellow British expatriates such as David Niven, Ronald Colman, and C. Aubrey Smith at the Hollywood Cricket Club, a refuge of cucumber sandwiches and starched whites in the Los Angeles sun. The club offered both camaraderie and some political opportunity. Members were expected to play on Sundays, and the bandy-legged Karloff served as a wicket-keeper. His teammates teased him for being prone to leg before wicket calls due to his ungainly stance. Matches were held at UCLA's football field until Smith convinced the city to build a proper ground in Griffith Park, complete with imported British grass. Yet the cricket field also became a meeting ground for a different sort of battle, the fight for actors' rights. In the spring of 1933, Karloff and Smith held clandestine gatherings at the club to discuss forming a union to combat the studio's punishing schedules and exploitative contracts. Producers enforced 6-day weeks, withheld overtime pay, and extended contracts indefinitely. Extras were treated in a manner that was barely human at all. To Karloff, who had endured his share of backbreaking work, this situation was intolerable, and he believed working actors could fight for better conditions. So he began to position himself at the forefront of this clandestine movement. Karloff always carried a roll of dimes so he could make secret telephone calls from payphones to finalize the details of their new guild before it went public. On 19th of July, 1933, he became member number 9 of the Screen Actors Guild. Alongside fellow cricketers Claude King and Alan Mowbray, he served on the Guild's first board of directors, using his star power to persuade reluctant colleagues. The Guild soon forced the studios to recognize actors' rights to rest periods, safe working conditions, and fair pay. Karloff remained on the board until 1951 and saw the union become a real bulwark against exploitation. The same qualities that humanized his monsters, empathy and a sense of justice, also drove his activism. In 1940, he took his compassion off the set and into hospitals. The Associated Press reported that he dressed as Santa Claus to distribute presents to children with disabilities at Beekman Hospital. The next year, he repeated the ritual, handing out gifts to 200 young patients while telling reporters, "I really love children, and I'm not half as bad as I'm painted." His voice even became a comfort for children when he read bedtime stories on New York's W New AM radio. In fact, he would later cement himself in the minds of youngsters from the 1960s when he narrated How the Grinch Stole Christmas, a Grammy-winning performance. During World War II, he performed benefit shows for the Motion Picture Relief Fund and visited wounded soldiers. He also renovated old churches and created a fund to support young athletes. Karloff used his own resources to repair buildings and sponsor sports equipment. On his farm, he kept dogs, chickens, turkeys, a cow named Elsie, and a pet pig. He tended vegetables and flowers and was known to deliver fresh produce to neighbors. His bottomless kindnesses baffled those who associated him with his on-screen monsters and villains. "Every time I walk into a room, there is a noticeable lull in the merrymaking," he joked. "I pat little children on the head and vote, yet strangers give queer stares." His wife, Dorothy, observed that playing sinister roles made him sweeter at home because he purged any latent malice through his characters. Dorothy Stein, a Montanan, became his spouse in 1930. She then gave birth to his only child, Sarah Jane, on the 23rd of November, 1938. The birth coincided with the filming of Son of Frankenstein. Desperate not to miss the birth of his first child, Karloff left the set in full monster makeup to attend the delivery, an act that surely alarmed a few on the maternity ward that day. However, the marriage soured as his career revived in the 1940s and became irreparable as he grew closer and closer to an old friend, Evelyn Hope Helmore. Undoubtedly, part of the problem was that Boris had never revealed the truth about his prior marriages to Dorothy or to his daughter, but he had been able to bare his soul to Evelyn. Finally, he and Dorothy decided to end their marriage, which was something of an administrative nightmare in those days. He spent 6 weeks in Boulder City, Nevada, to establish residency for a divorce, living at the Boulder Dam Hotel and performing charity events during his stay. On the 10th of April, 1946, he divorced Dorothy, and on the 11th of April, married his longtime friend, Evelyn. Evie remained at his side for the rest of his life, knitting quietly on sets and accompanying him on tours. Sarah stayed with her mother in Los Angeles while Karloff and Evie moved to New York in 1949. And it was Evie, in fact, who later revealed to Sarah the shocking truth about her father's 4 previous marriages. Karloff's relationship with Dorothy and Sarah remained cordial. He provided them with financial support and visited his daughter often. Sarah, who actually shares his birthday, later said her father was an inherently lovely human being, and claimed that his monstrous roles were a shield for a gentle soul. By the mid-1940s, the Universal horror cycle had grown tired. Seeking fresher material, Karloff signed with producer Val Lewton at RKO. Lewton's low-budget films emphasized psychological dread over monsters, and they gave Karloff roles that challenged him. For example, in Robert Wise's 1945 film The Body Snatcher, he played a sly coachman who robs graves to supply cadavers to a medical school. Critics noted the ambiguity of a character who is kind to children and animals, yet murders an innocent dog in his pursuit. Karloff relished the chance to deliver literate dialogue and work with talented filmmakers like Wise. He later said that Lewton, quote, saved my soul by freeing him from caricature. He followed later that year with Isle of the Dead, playing a Greek general trapped on a plague-infested island, and then Bedlam in 1946, portraying a corporate asylum keeper. These films allowed him to explore moral complexity while still drawing on his ability to instill fear with an intense gaze from that uniquely uncanny face. On stage, he scored a hit in Broadway's black comedy Arsenic and Old Lace. This was a dark comedy where he played Jonathan Brewster, a murderer whose botched plastic surgery leaves him, rather ironically, looking like Boris Karloff. Each night, the actor playing his character's brother delivered the line, "He looks like Boris Karloff," to roars of laughter as Karloff himself stands there as Jonathan. The play ran for 1,444 performances and established him as a stage star. Critics applauded and loved his comedic timing and the unique nature of the actor-character relationship, and Karloff reprised the role on tour. In 1956, he also earned a Tony nomination for his portrayal of a compassionate bishop in Jean Anouilh's The Lark. He also played Captain Hook in a revival of Peter Pan. The fun he had frightening children on stage in character was tempered by his custom of greeting them afterwards with a smile and candy canes. Television and radio provided new outlets for his voice. He appeared in the series Colonel March of Scotland Yard as a monocled detective investigating impossible crimes, and hosted the anthology Thriller from 1960 to 1962, where he introduced macabre tales with courtly menace. He recorded albums of poetry and ghost stories, including the best-selling An Evening with Boris Karloff and His Friends, and in 1966 he made his turn in Dr. Seuss's How the Grinch Stole Christmas. Children who had once written letters to the Frankenstein monster now wrote to thank the Grinch for returning the toys. Karloff delighted in those letters and responded personally when he could, often sending autographed photos or small gifts. He continued to host radio shows in which he read fairy tales. Even as his lungs weakened, he recorded albums of children's verse, although he was working between bouts of coughing. The 1960s brought a resurgence of Gothic horror on screen, this time with a more lurid and colorful tone. Director Roger Corman cast Karloff opposite two fellow legends of the genre, Vincent Price and Peter Lorre in The Raven and the Terror, allowing him to spoof his own image while still emanating menace. Italian filmmaker Mario Bava's giallo anthology, I Tre Volti della Paura, or The Three Faces of Fear, gave him a triple role, including a vampire patriarch who rises from the grave in the episode titled The Verdulac. Distributors decided the film's Italian title sounded underwhelming when directly translated into English, so they gave it a whole new title, one which inspired a certain Birmingham band to rename themselves Black Sabbath after seeing a poster across from their rehearsal space. This then linked Karloff indirectly to the birth of heavy metal. The film was an ordeal to shoot, as he was by then suffering from severe arthritis and emphysema, and he was often inhaling oxygen from a mask between takes. Still, he continued to accept roles that interested him, despite his ailing health. In 1967's The Sorcerers, he played a hypnotist who controls a young man's mind. This was a smart film that got into themes of media manipulation and something of a forgotten gem. His final major performance came in Peter Bogdanovich's thrilling and shocking postmodern movie, Targets, in 1968. The film juxtaposes the fading world of Gothic horror with contemporary gun violence. Karloff plays Byron Orlock, a retiring horror star who confronts a modern mass shooter. His character's name is a nod to the infamous romantic poet Lord Byron, and the protagonist of F.W. Murnau's silent horror masterwork, Nosferatu. During filming, Karloff was as game as ever, even though he was using leg braces to remain standing as well as oxygen tanks. He hesitated only once over a line that belittled the horror films of the past, and, by association, seemed to mock his own entire career. Peter Bogdanovich convinced him that audiences would recognize it as affectionate self-parody. In one remarkable scene shot in a single take, Karloff delivered a masterful monologue, taken from W. Somerset Maugham's retelling of The Appointment in Samara, and it was some of his finest acting. His daughter Sarah later said he spoke of Targets as his finest film, largely because it dealt with genuine human terror rather than rubber monsters. As he aged, the physical toll of decades of manual labor and heavy costumes caught up with him. Arthritis twisted his spine, and his lungs, scarred by years of cigarette smoke and plaster dust, began to fail entirely. Yet he remained determined to die in harness, as Evelyn put it. In 1968, he traveled to Los Angeles dragging his oxygen tanks behind him to film a series of low-budget Mexican horror movies such as House of Evil and Fear Chamber. Between takes, he once more sat with a respirator. When the cameras rolled, he straightened his shoulders and delivered his lines with vigor. The scheduling travel nearly killed him, but he insisted on fulfilling his contracts. In fact, he'd been out of the United States for the best part of a decade by that point. In 1959, he had moved back to England. Many questioned his decision, especially due to the extreme nature of British taxes at that time. But Karloff shrugged them off as a price he was willing to pay for the cool weather and culture. Friends recall that he happily returned to the British customs he'd been born into, making tea for visitors, insisting on discussing cricket scores, and sometimes reciting Shakespeare. Throughout the 60s, he continued to raise funds for the Motion Picture Relief Fund and for children's hospitals. He also supported civil rights causes and quietly donated to groups fighting racism and censorship, perhaps mindful of his own need to conceal his heritage through so much of his life. His last months were marked by repeated hospitalizations. In November 1968, he entered King Edward VII Hospital in Midhurst, West Sussex, suffering from pneumonia, arthritis, and lung complications. He died there on the 2nd of February 1969 at the age of 81. The funeral was private and simple. News of his death prompted tributes that emphasized the contrast between his on-screen villains and his off-screen kindness. Ronald Reagan, who had worked with him, described him as one of the warmest, kindest, most gentle human beings I have ever met. His life tells a story that empathy is a form of strength, and that even those cast as monsters can become champions for others. As Karloff believed, the true monsters are those who exploit their fellow man in the name of greed. Through his example, Hollywood learned that monstrous makeup can mask a gentle heart, and that audiences crave complexity, even in creatures. That's about all for this Halloween special edition of Hollywood Mysteries. This episode was brought about by the enormously generous support of our top-tier Patreon supporter, Valerie Filito. As a top-tier supporter, Valerie gets to pick a figure she'd like me to cover. So, Valerie, I really hope you enjoyed this one, and thank you once again. And to all of our supporters on both Patreon and here as YouTube members, it makes all the difference. If you'd like to support the channel, there are various perks for doing so, depending on the tier you pick. For $3 a month, you get access to my second series, Hollywood Histories, where I get into all kinds of unusual aspects of Hollywood's past in a weekly podcast. There's also early access to videos and a range of other benefits, so take a look at the Patreon link in the description, or click join below this video on YouTube to find out more. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share with a friend, and why not leave me a comment to tell me your favorite Karloff performance. Until next time, sweet dreams.